The book, Soft Minimal, published by Gestalten and by Jonas. Is it just you who has put input into the book, or is it your team as well?
It's Norm Architects, so it's the whole team. It's a collaborative effort.
For me, one of the interesting things about the book is its structure. The 8 themes in 8 chapters, going through not only your style, but also through your entire history of when you took over Norm.
Well, I think if we start out with how the book Soft Minimal is structured, it's not your typical monograph. It's more, let's say, a manifesto. The first step for the book was taken more than 15 years ago when we started out the company. We wrote like a small 1-page manifest called Soft Minimalism. And it has been kind of our guideline ever since. And of course, it has elaborated over these 15 years through countless projects, and we've learned a lot along the way. So these 8 chapters that talk about how we can re-essentialize our built environment are kind of the foundation for the book, and then illustrated with images from different projects all over the globe.
And how did this content get to you, Robert?
I think first of all, we had a conversation about the book in general. And at a very early point, Jonas and the team came up with the idea of doing a book that's based on their sort of guiding star of soft minimalism, but also not structured in a typical project structure, but more summoned under these various different virtues and definitions. And I know that this is a very, very tall order, and usually it's not something that you can do easily or lightly. And therefore, I'm very pleased that the outcome doesn't just live up to the expectations, that lives beyond the expectations, I think.
I think we had a lot of interesting conversations about what is the relevance of a book in a digital world where everybody can go into our website, see all our projects chronologically or by category. How can we do this in a different way? Of course, there's all the sensorial elements of actually touching paper, seeing print, working with the covers, and that makes a book different from scrolling down an iPad or something like that. But there was also the possibility of working with the content in a completely different way. I mean, people read differently in books than they do digitally. The attention span is much longer with a physical book. And I thought it made it interesting to do something and give the audience something that they couldn't find browsing the internet.
I think the emotional engagement with the content happens on a very different level.
Yeah.
And I think what we are always hearing from people who give us some kind of feedback on a book, they say, this is where I want to be. You know, it's not about where they are, but it sort of ideally propels them closer to the person who they want to be or what they think is relevant in their lives. And this is what books can do, and what books maybe do better than other media. And therefore a lot of the books are used as gifts or as kind of inspiration, or sort of make people remember their goals in life. And I think it's one of the rare opportunities that you have somebody who can, like Norm, also give people very clear guidance on what kind of principle they followed, so that maybe they can sort of be inspired by sort of following same principles, or maybe having their own principles. But I think it's really something that happens very well with books, much better than with digital content, for whatever reason.
I think it was just important for us to do, you know, like a really beautiful coffee table book that also had a message. Being a book lover, I have a lot of books at home that are super beautiful. I love images, I love photography. But it seems there are a lot of books that doesn't have the layer of copy to the same extent. So really finding that level where you can use the book on multiple levels, browsing through it, getting inspired if you're really like inspired by images, architecture, and places, but also diving into the text. And all the 8 chapters in the book, they stand alone, but together they compile into our, let's say, coherent design philosophy.
When you make a book like Soft Minimalism, are you thinking also a few re-editions ahead, or how?
I don't think I've thought that far yet, but we had that conversation. I said to Robert very early on in discussing the book that I didn't feel if it was the right time. And I remember you said there's never the right time to make a book. You need to draw a line in the sand at some point and then just get on with it. And then you can always see what happens further down the road. But I think in working with selecting the images that are in the book, for example, I think we started with more than 6,000 images that has now been kind of like distilled down to 300 plus. I really thought about, selecting images that felt like they had longevity, like there were some kind of timelessness to them, so you don't produce something that gets dated. That has been really important in the whole selection process.
So how do you think that soft minimalism fits into right now what design is evolving into? Where do you see Norm's place?
Well, I think the key message in soft minimalism is in many ways quite simple and maybe even banal, that we need to re-centralize our built environment, that we need to make spaces that cater to all the 5 senses that we have as human beings and that can enrich our lives and our essence of well-being. And I think the challenge is that after industrialization, urbanization, mass production, and let's say a rational approach to our built environment, we're left with big cities where most of us live that are quite detached from what actually makes us feel good, what works for us as a human species. So we try to look into psychology, philosophy, anthropology, biology, to see if there are like any universal truths that can be applied to architecture, design, all over the world that transcends, let's say, cultural preferences, fashions, trends. And I think if you look at like the average building today, even in Copenhagen, where we have pretty high standards, you arrive at something that's fitted with painted aluminum frames. It's white plasterwall architecture. All the way inside, the floors are like engineered floors. You can't really tell whether it's wood or plastic. You arrive at your apartment through badly LED lit hallways. And there's nothing, let's say, that speaks to your senses. There's nothing that seems natural in that type of building. So even though the message is simple and it's what good architects have always done, there's a real need, I think, for creating architecture that actually address our basic needs as human beings, a reconnection with nature.
I think I would second that, but I would also maybe like to add that the idea of restraint in design and architecture is not new. It's just been totally exploited and it's been misused to create spaces for the sake of efficiency, for cost reduction, and so on and so forth. There was I think, some visionary designers, architects back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, who had a lot of these ideas, and they thought probably that they would do something that would be highly beneficial to the society. And I think over time, society, designers, communities have, I think, forgotten the core values of what it's all about. It means that restraint, that avoid is not necessarily bad for as long as you have the sort of self-confidence to live with this and do not feel that you are somehow of a lesser important than somebody else. And I think this is what I found extremely interesting in the whole concept of soft minimalism, that on the one side, minimalism is not new, but it is a kind of a remembrance, it's a kind of a revisiting, a kind of resuscitation of the essence of what minimalism and restraint originally meant, and seeing value in that. And I think it's very beautiful that in this book, Jonas and his team do not just refer to, you know, thoughts that would be based in European culture, but also there are the same kind of ideas in Japan, in Asia, in other places, in other philosophy, and they always center around human well-being. And that is exactly why I feel this approach of soft minimal is something that is very well suited in the zeitgeist today.
I think Robert is completely right. If we talk about the distinction between hard minimalism, let's say that, and soft minimalism, on the other hand, I think ever since Adolf Loos spoke about ornament and crime, and later on Mies van der Rohe with less is more in the Bauhaus movement, they had really success in creating what has now become our modern or contemporary built society, and that really works well if there's an attention to detail, if there's good craftsmanship, if there's natural materials, and you'll find all of that inside a Mies van der Rohe building that's pretty void as a spatial construct. But the problem is when it's translated into a building industry where there's no attention to detail, where there are no natural materials and no spatial qualities, then it becomes a problem. But I would say, of course, we stand on the shoulders of a lot of great modernist thinkers that made beautiful buildings, but we also feel very linked, I think, to other cultures of simplicity, as Robert mentioned, like the Shaker movement in the US, the arts and craft movement in Great Britain, the Wiener Werkstätte, traditional Japanese culture like the Ming period. So there are a lot of cultures all over the world, even peasant cultures, that really design, you know, beautiful, functional objects that can stand the test of time. Looking at an Egyptian chair that was made 5,000 years ago, it's not that far from what you see in wooden chair design today. I mean, there are just things that work, that relate to our body, that is designed with empathy to our human psyche, and that stimulates our senses.
I think maybe I would just sort of develop this thought a little further that we just spoke about restraint and about quality and about all that. I think we're not analog Taliban in a way. You know, we have our phones, we go about, we have social media, and that's all fine, it's all great. At the same time, we feel that, you know, still books have this place and importance, especially these days. And it's not just something that evolves around books. If you look at how music has moved into streaming and Spotify, at the same time you have that kind of counter movement when suddenly people start buying vinyl again, or they go to concerts, because what they're missing is the kind of experience, the tactility of something, the emotional quality that they get out of it. And they do not necessarily get the kind of emotional quality out of something that's just streamed. And people didn't really sort of queue around the block for the Fire and Fury website, they did it for the book. And I think to some extent books are relevant because they help people to remember what's important to them and what they should be caring about. And that applies even more when people go digital. I think I do not really understand this to be sort of a dichotomy or some opposites, and I do not see this as a pendulum that swings from the analog to the digital. Right from the start, I think we were very much looking into what's happening online, and we wouldn't necessarily be able to find all the people we work with if we were just to have a company that's solely based on analog means. But I think keeping that in mind and keeping a reader in mind and keeping a community in mind is really sort of what helps us decide what kind of projects we'd like to take on and which ones we wouldn't.